Winter came early with no firewood. She built a brick monster. Merritt Yarrow, who had freighted wood through 24 Missouri winters, told her, "Without 8 cords stacked, your 2 children will freeze before Candlemas." She had $47, 2 children, and no team to haul the 8 cords Winter demanded. On November 17, 1886, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in a day. But 4 months earlier, Rosina Ternay had never laid a heating flue in her life. She had arrived at the Heart River Breaks in the first week of August, 1886, with a husband who knew the land and a wagon packed tight with everything they owned. Rosina Ternay was 31 years old. She had crossed an ocean, buried a mother in steerage, and survived 2 cholera summers in the Odessa steppe before Kaspar convinced her that Dakota Territory was where their children would finally stop being afraid. The claim sat 12 miles southwest of Mandan, a quarter section of grass and wind that Kaspar said would make them landowners for the first time in 4 generations. He had filed in his name, built the cabin frame in June, and promised Rosina a root cellar before the first frost. He died in July. The hay wagon overturned on a cut-bank road 3 miles from the cabin. The mule spooked at a snake. The load shifted, and Kaspar went under the wheels before he could jump clear. A neighbor found him at dusk, already cold, his neck bent at an angle that told the whole story without words. Rosina buried him on the rise behind the cabin where he had wanted to plant an orchard. She marked the grave with field stones because she could not afford a proper marker. Then she walked back to the cabin, sat on the packed earth floor, and opened the tobacco tin where they kept their money. $47.50. That was what remained of 2 years of saving, 1 Atlantic crossing, and 3 months of Dakota labor. $47 to prove up a claim that required 3 more years of residence. $47 to feed 2 children through a winter that everyone said would be hard. Marta was 8. She had her father's square jaw and her mother's way of going silent when things turned bad. Jakob was 5, small for his age, afraid of the wind at night. They stood in the doorway watching Rosina count the coins. And they did not ask what would happen next because they already knew their mother did not have an answer. The cabin Kaspar built was not a home. It was a claim shanty, 1 room, 16 feet by 14, with walls of green lumber and tar paper stretched over the gaps. The roof was sawed over rough planks. The floor was dirt packed hard and swept clean, but dirt all the same. Newspaper stuffed the cracks between boards that had already begun to shrink. When the wind blew from the north, the candle flames bent sideways. In one corner sat a cast-iron stove Kaspar had bought used from a family leaving for Oregon. The stove was small, cracked along one leg, and required constant feeding to throw any heat at all. Its pipe rose through the roof at an angle that made Rosina nervous, and the draft was poor on days when the barometer dropped. This was the inheritance. A cabin half finished. A well that gave water but not much of it. 3 sides of fence around a pasture that held nothing but 1 tired mule. A husband's grave on the hill. And 2 children who needed to survive until spring. Rosina had never felled a tree in her life. The neighbors came in the first week after the burial. They brought food, mostly. A loaf of bread here, a crock of beans there, the currency of frontier grief. They also brought advice, which was free and therefore plentiful. The advice was unanimous. Rosina should sell the mule, pack the children into a wagon, and return to Mandan before the first snow. She could work as a cook or laundress. She could marry again. A widow with 2 children was not ideal. But she was young enough and strong enough to interest a man who needed help more than he needed romance. The claim could be abandoned. The cabin could rot. No one would blame her. Rosina listened to all of it. She thanked each visitor. She did not argue. She also did not pack. What the neighbors did not understand was that Rosina had nowhere to go. She had no family left in Odessa. She had no family in America, except the 2 children eating her food and wearing her patience thin. Mandan was not a destination. It was a place where widows went to wash other people's clothes until they died. The claim was not a choice. It was the only ground in the world that belonged to her. Under territorial law, she could prove it up in her own name now that Caspar was gone. A widow could homestead just like a man. All she had to do was survive. Or the wood question arrived before she was ready for it. Merritt Yarrow pulled his sled up to her cabin on a September afternoon, delivering cordwood to a family 2 miles north. He was 53 years old, lean and weathered, with a beard that had gone gray in patches like a map of hard winters. He had cut and freighted wood through 24 Missouri winters before coming to Dakota, and he knew the fuel arithmetic of the northern plains the way a banker knew interest rates. He stopped to water his horses at Rosina's trough. She came out to meet him because that was what you did when a neighbor stopped. You offered water, you made small talk, you asked about the road conditions. But Merritt Yarrow did not make small talk. He looked at her cabin. He looked at the stovepipe jutting from the roof at its crooked angle. He looked at the empty space beside the north wall, where a wood pile should have been stacking itself for winter. "Where's your wood?" he said. Rosina told him she had not started cutting yet. She told him the cottonwoods along the river were fenced now, and she did not have a team strong enough to haul from the distant timber. She told him she was planning to buy some loads from the freighters when she had the cash. Merritt listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he took off his hat and rubbed his forehead, like a man working out a difficult sum. "How many stoves?" he asked. "One." "That one?" He pointed at the crooked pipe. "Yes." "How big is the cabin?" 16 by 14. "Green lumber walls?" "Tar paper over green lumber. Sawed outside." Merritt put his hat back on. He looked at the cabin again. He then looked at Rosina, and his expression shifted into something that was not quite pity and not quite contempt, but lived in the uncomfortable space between them. "That stove will eat a cord a week once the true wind starts," he said. "Call it 6 weeks of hard winter, maybe 7. You need 8 cords stacked minimum, probably 10 to be safe." Rosina did not answer. She could not answer. The number was impossible. "You've got $40-some," Merritt continued. He had heard the gossip, apparently. Everyone had heard the gossip. "Cordwood is running $6 a cord delivered, maybe 5 if you haul it yourself. But you don't have a team that can haul, so call it 6. That's $48 just for wood. And then you've got nothing left for food, nothing for medicine, and nothing for the blacksmith when your mule throws a shoe." "I can gather deadfall," Rosina said. "I can burn chips." "Chips are fine for cooking. They're not enough for heating. And the deadfall around here is picked clean by November. You know who owns the best timber on the river?" "Halliday." "That's right, Dexter Halliday. And he's not selling to homesteaders, not hauling for homesteaders, and not letting homesteaders cut on his lease. He wants this whole stretch for grazing. He wants you gone." Rosina said nothing. Merritt Yarrow stepped closer. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped, and the words came out slow and heavy, like stones being laid on a scale. "Without 8 cords stacked, your 2 children will freeze in that shanty before Candlemas." He waited for her to respond. She did not respond. "I'm not trying to be cruel," he said. "I'm trying to tell you the truth while there's still time to do something about it. Sell the mule, pack the children, get out before the first hard blow." He climbed back onto his sled. He clicked his tongue at the horses. He did not look back. Rosina stood in the September sunlight and watched him go. The wind picked up. Somewhere to the north, geese were moving. She could hear them calling, faint and far, a sound that meant the season was turning. She went back inside. She looked at the cast iron stove. She looked at the crooked pipe. She put her hand on the pipe where it rose through the roof, and she felt the warmth that had been escaping there all afternoon while she fed the stove chips and scraps. The warmth was leaving, the heat went up, the smoke went out, and the room stayed cold. So she stood there for a long time, her palm against the pipe, thinking about a house she had not seen in 15 years. Her grandmother's house in the Odessa steppe had been built of earth and straw and stone. The walls were 2 feet thick. In the center of the main room stood a masonry stove that reached almost to the ceiling, a whitewashed block of brick and clay that radiated warmth for hours after the fire inside it died. Rosina remembered sleeping near that stove as a child. She remembered waking in the night and pressing her hand against the warm plaster. She remembered her grandmother explaining that the secret was not the fire itself, but the brick that held the fire's heat. The fire burned fast and hot. The brick absorbed what the fire gave, and then the brick released that warmth slowly, steadily, through the long Russian night. "Jer, you don't feed a good stove," her grandmother had said. "You charge it, and then you let it work." Rosina had not thought about that stove in years. She had not thought about the Odessa house since she buried her mother at sea. But now, standing in a Dakota claim shanty with her hand on a pipe that was wasting heat faster than she could feed fuel into the stove, the memory came back with a weight that surprised her. The problem was not fire. She could make fire. The problem was that the heat from the fire was racing up the pipe and out into the sky before it could warm the room. The stove was an iron box that got hot fast and cooled fast. The pipe was a chimney that sucked warmth away like a thief in the night. What if the smoke did not leave so quickly? The question formed in her mind before she knew she was asking it. What if the smoke had to travel farther before it escaped? What if the heat was trapped in something heavy, something that would hold it the way her grandmother's brick walls held the warmth of a morning fire through an afternoon blizzard? She found a charcoal stick. She turned over a flour sack, and she began to sketch. The drawing was crude, a rectangle for the cabin, a smaller rectangle for the stove, lines that represented walls and channels she did not yet know how to build. But the logic was there, scratching itself into existence on the rough cloth. A central mass, 4 feet by 4.5, built from clay blocks dried in the sun, stacked and mortared. Inside, a firebox lined with hard-burned brick that could withstand the hottest flame. Above and around the firebox, channels, zigzag passages that forced the smoke to travel sideways and down and up again before it reached the chimney. 20 feet of path, maybe more. Every foot of that path would be brick or clay, absorbing heat that would otherwise vanish. The smoke would enter hot. The smoke would leave cool. And the heat that stayed behind would live in the masonry for hours, radiant warmth that did not require constant feeding, constant watching, constant fear. She worked the numbers in her head. A structure that size would weigh thousands of pounds. It would need a foundation dug down to hard ground. It would require hundreds of clay blocks, maybe 600, maybe more. The firebox alone would need 100 bricks, or better, hard-burned bricks that could take flame without cracking. She did not have 600 clay blocks. She did not have 100 hard-burned bricks. She did not have the knowledge to lay a proper flue or build a proper firebox. But she had clay. The riverbank was thick with it. She had sand. The bottom land held more than she could ever use. She had straw and dried manure and all the time left before the first killing frost. And she had the memory of her grandmother's hands pressing against warm plaster in a house that no longer existed, in a country she would never see again. Beret Solheim came by the next morning. Beret was Norwegian, 42 years old, settled on a quarter section 1.5 miles to the east. Her husband had died 3 years earlier, influenza, the fast kind, and she had proved up the claim alone with 2 teenage sons who were now grown and working railroad crews out of Bismarck. She knew what it meant to be a widow on the plains, and she had decided, apparently, that Rosina needed looking after. She arrived with a jar of pickled beets and an expression that said she had heard about the clay. "The Peterson boy told me you were digging by the river," Beret said. "He said you pulled out half a wagon load of mud and hauled it back here." Rosina did not deny it. There was nothing to deny. The clay was sitting in a pile behind the cabin, covered with wet cloth to keep it workable. "What are you building?" Beret asked. Rosina showed her the sketch. She explained the channels. She explained the firebox. She explained the logic of storing heat in mass instead of losing it up a pipe. Beret listened. She looked at the sketch for a long time. She looked at the pile of clay behind the cabin. She looked at the cast iron stove sitting cold in the corner of the room. "You want to put 7,000 pounds of brick in the middle of this cabin," Beret said. 6 or 7,000, yes." "On this floor?" "No, I'll dig down to hard ground, lay a footing, stone and rubble, then the clay on top." "You'll cut a hole in your floor." "I will cut a hole in my floor." Beret set down the pickled beets. She crossed her arms. She was not a cruel woman, but she was a practical one, and the practical part of her was winning the argument behind her eyes. "Rosina," she said, "listen to me. I watched 3 families try to make it through winter with less wood than they needed. 2 of them made it. 1 did not. The Lindqvist boy lost both feet to frostbite, and his mother died in February from a cough she could not shake. That is what happens when the fuel runs out." "I know what happens." "Then you know this," she pointed at the sketch, "is a gamble. If you spend the next month making mud bricks instead of gathering wood, and the thing does not work, you will have no wood and no heat, and 2 children who trust you to keep them alive." "If I spend the next month gathering wood," Rosina said, "I will have 2 cords, maybe 3, and Merritt Yarrow says I need 8. Merritt Yarrow says a lot of things." "He's not wrong." Beret exhaled. She looked around the cabin again, at the tar paper walls, the green lumber already shrinking, the newspaper stuffed in the cracks. "What if the floor sinks under the weight?" she asked. "What if the blocks crack when you fire them? What if smoke fills the room and chokes your children in their sleep? Then I will die knowing I tried something that should have worked." "Should have is not did work." "No," Rosina said, "it isn't, but I don't have another choice." Beret stared at her. The silence stretched. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, and somewhere along the river bottom, a crow called 3 times and went quiet. "You really believe this will work?" Beret said. It was not a question. "I believe it can work," Rosina said. "I believe my grandmother knew something about heat that these iron stoves have forgotten, and I believe I'm going to die anyway if I do nothing, so I might as well die trying to build something worth building." Beret picked up the pickled beets. She tucked them under her arm. She walked to the door. "I'll come back in a week," she said. "If you're still digging, I'll bring my old ox. He's slow, but he can pull more than that mule of yours." It was not approval. It was not belief. But it was not abandonment either. Rosina took it. She made her first test brick that afternoon. The formula came from memory and guesswork. River clay, sand, chopped straw, a handful of dried manure. She mixed it in an old wash tub, kneading with her forearms until the consistency felt right, dense and sticky, but not so wet that it would crack as it dried. She packed the mixture into a wooden frame Jakob held steady. She tamped it flat with a mallet. She turned the frame over onto a plank and lifted, leaving a wet brick 10 inches long, 5 inches wide, and 3 inches thick. Then she covered it with cloth and left it in the shade behind the cabin. 3 days later, she unwrapped it. The brick had dried without splitting. The corners were intact. When she pressed her thumb against the surface, the clay held firm. She dropped it from waist height onto the packed earth, and it did not shatter. It was not proof. It was not certainty. But it was enough to make the next 10 bricks, and the next 20 after that, and the next 100 after that. The work began. Dexter Halliday rode up on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. He was 51 years old, thick-set, with a face that had been handsome once and was now merely confident. He ran cattle on lease land that stretched from the river to the breaks, and he had made it clear from the beginning that he did not welcome homesteaders. The homesteaders took water his cattle needed. They built fences that interrupted his grazing routes. They complained to the territorial authorities when his stock trampled their crops. Every claim that succeeded was a claim that made his operation smaller and more complicated. Halliday wanted the claims to fail. He wanted the quarter sections to revert. He wanted the water and the grass and the timber for himself, and he was patient enough to wait for winter to do his work. He rode up alone, which was unusual. Normally, he sent his foreman to deliver warnings and demands, but Rosina's clay blocks had become interesting enough to warrant a personal visit. She saw him coming from the rise where she was turning bricks. She did not stop working. She did not walk down to greet him. She waited until he pulled his horse to a stop near the drying racks and swung down from the saddle. Mrs. Turns, he said. He tipped his hat. His manners were polished when he wanted them to be. Mr. Halliday. He walked along the racks, looking at the bricks. There were nearly 200 now, arranged in rows, drying under canvas that Beret had brought. My men tell me you've been hauling clay from the river, he said. A lot of clay, more than anyone would need for patching a chimney. They tell you right. They also tell me you're planning to build some kind of oven in the middle of your cabin. He smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes. A courthouse oven, one of them called it, like you're baking bread for the territorial legislature. Rosina kept turning bricks. She did not look at him. What I build in my cabin is my business, she said. True enough. But what you build with my timber is my business. He stepped closer. I heard you tried to cut cottonwood on the river lease last month. My foreman turned you away. He did. Good, because that timber is mine, every stick of it, and if I catch you or your children cutting so much as a twig on my land, I will have you charged with theft, and I will make sure every merchant in Mandan knows about it. Rosina stopped turning bricks. She straightened up. She looked at Dexter Halliday for the first time since he arrived. I'm not cutting your timber, she said. I'm building with clay. Clay won't burn. You'll need wood to fire that thing, whatever it is. Where are you planning to get it? I'll manage. Will you? Halliday laughed. It was a short, unpleasant sound. Mrs. Turnes, I've been on this land for 6 years. I've seen a dozen homesteaders come and go. The ones who made it had money or family, or both. The ones who didn't have either one are buried on their claims or moved back east with nothing but the clothes they wore. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the clay bricks. He looked at Rosina. You don't have money. You don't have family. You don't have a team that can haul. And you don't have timber rights on the only decent wood for 20 miles. What you have is a pile of mud and a notion that you can build your way out of a problem that has killed better people than you. He walked back to his horse. He gathered the reins. He swung into the saddle. When you abandon this place, he said, I'm going to use those bricks to line a cattle trough. That's the best use I can think of for a brick monster. He kicked the horse into motion. He did not look back. Rosina watched him go. Her hands were steady, but her jaw was tight, and the muscle in her cheek kept jumping. She turned back to the bricks. She kept working. The gossip spread faster than she expected. By the first week of October, everyone within 10 miles knew about the widow Turns and her courthouse oven. The story had a dozen versions, each less flattering than the last. She was building a bake oven because she had gone simple from grief. She was building a smokehouse because she thought she could cure meat without killing any animals. She was building a tomb for her husband because she had lost her mind and decided to bury him indoors. The laughter followed her to the general store in Mandan. It followed her to the ferry landing. No, it followed Marta to the schoolhouse and Jacob to the Sunday service where children whispered behind their hands. Rosina did not explain herself. She did not argue. She did not try to convince anyone that she knew what she was doing. She kept making bricks. By mid-October, she had 380 blocks drying under canvas. She had mixed 14 batches of mortar. She had worn through one pair of gloves and cracked the calluses on both palms until they bled and scabbed and bled again. Marta helped her turn bricks morning and evening. Jacob gathered chips and dried dung for the small cooking fires, saving every scrap of real wood for the curing process to come. They ate less than they had in August. They slept harder. And they did not complain because they could see their mother was not stopping, and children understand more than adults think. The first frost came on the night of October 16th. Rosina woke before dawn, saw the white crust on the grass outside the window, and felt the cold in her chest like a fist. She checked the bricks immediately. 6 along the edge of the stack had frozen at the corners, cracking where the water inside had expanded into ice. She pulled the damaged blocks from the rack. She crushed them with the mallet. She mixed the fragments back into a fresh batch of clay. Then she worked faster. On the afternoon of October 21st, a man she did not recognize stopped his wagon beside the drying racks. He was old, 57, maybe 60, with a weathered face and hands that had spent decades working with something heavier than reins. He wore a coat that had been patched many times and a hat that had lost its shape to seasons of rain and sun. He climbed down from the wagon slowly, like a man whose joints remembered every cold morning they had ever endured. He walked to the racks without introducing himself. He picked up one of the bricks. He turned it over. He pressed his thumb into the surface, testing the density. Then he looked at Rosina. "Who taught you to mix this?" he asked. "No one taught me. I remembered how my grandmother's house was built." "Where was your grandmother's house?" "Near Odessa, in the steppe." The man nodded. He put the brick back. He looked at the cabin, at the crooked stovepipe, at the pile of sand and straw waiting beside the mixing tub. "Your clay is good," he said. "Your proportions are close. But your blocks are drying too fast at the corners. You need to turn them more often, and you need to keep the morning sun off them until they've cured for at least 4 days. Rosina stared at him. She had not been given advice that precise since Caspar died. "Who are you?" she asked. "Matias Heert," he said. "I'm from the Mennonite settlement downstream. I came up to help build a bake oven for a family near the crossing. I heard about your project in town." "You heard the jokes." "I heard the jokes." He smiled. It was a small smile, worn thin by years. "I also heard the description. River clay blocks, a central mass, channels for the smoke. That does not sound like a joke to me." "It sounds like a masonry heater." "Yes, it does." He looked at her again, and this time his eyes were measuring her the way a craftsman measures wood. "In the old country, I apprenticed under a stove mason. I helped build 14 heaters before I came west. I know how they work, and I know what happens when they are built wrong." Rosina felt something shift in her chest. Hope, maybe, or fear that hope might be false. "Can you teach me?" she asked. Matias Heert did not answer immediately. He walked to the cabin. He looked at the walls, the roof, the floor. He came back. "I will not build it for you," he said. "If I build it, you will not understand it, and when something goes wrong, you will not know how to fix it. But if you are willing to learn, I will help you build it right. CTA 1. The wind came up. The first geese of the evening lifted from the river, calling as they rose. Rosina looked at the old man with the patched coat and the hands that knew brick, and she understood that this was the answer she had not known she was praying for. I'm willing, she said. Matias nodded. He walked back to his wagon. Tomorrow, he said, we start with the foundation. If your clay blocks are not ready to hold 7,000 pounds by the time winter comes, nothing else will matter. He climbed onto the wagon seat. He clicked his tongue at the horse. Rosina watched him go. The sun was low, the air was sharp, and 400 drying bricks stretched out behind her in neat rows that had no meaning unless they became a heater that worked. Tomorrow she would learn if that was possible. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Matias arrived at first light with a shovel, a level, and in a coil of rope marked at intervals with knots. He did not greet Rosina with pleasantries. He walked directly to the center of the cabin floor, studied the packed earth, and began to pace. The stove sits here, he said, stopping 4 feet from the cook corner. Not against the wall, never against the wall. A heater on an outside wall is half a gift to the weather. He drove a stake into the dirt floor. He measured 4 feet in one direction, 4.5 in another, and drove 3 more stakes. Then he tied the rope between them, creating a rectangle that cut the cabin almost in half. This is the footprint, he said. Everything inside these ropes comes out. We dig down to hard ground, 2 feet, maybe 2.5. Then we fill with stone and rubble, pack it tight. Want to inlay the first course of blocks on top. Rosina looked at the rectangle. It was enormous. It would dominate the cabin. It would change everything about how the family lived in this space. That's where the children sleep, she said. Then they will sleep on the other side, against the warm mass instead of the cold wall. Matias picked up the shovel. You have a pickaxe? Behind the cabin. Get it. They worked through the morning. Rosina broke the packed earth with the pickaxe, while Matias shoveled the loosened dirt into a pile outside the door. Marta carried water. Jacob kept the fire going in the iron stove, which they would need until the new heater was finished and cured. By noon, they had cleared the first foot of soil. The ground beneath was harder, clay mixed with gravel, compacted by years of weight. Matias tested it with his boot heel. Good, he said. This will hold. But we need another foot at least. The mass cannot sit on topsoil. They kept digging. The first teaching came that afternoon when Rosina's arms were shaking and her back felt like a rope stretched too tight. Matias stopped her at the clay pit behind the cabin. He picked up a handful of the raw material and rolled it between his palms. This is good clay, he said. Dense, heavy, but it is not all the same. He pointed to a darker seam running through the bank. This part has too much silt. It will crack when it dries. This part, he pointed lower, has sand already mixed in. Better for blocks, but not for mortar. He showed her how to test consistency by dropping a ball of wet clay from shoulder height. If it shattered, too dry. If it flattened without breaking, too wet. If it cracked in a star pattern but held its shape, perfect. Your grandmother knew this, he said. She learned it from her mother, who learned it from hers. The knowledge is old. The iron stove is new. People forget what they knew before the new thing arrived. He showed her the proper ratio. 3 parts clay to 1 part sand to a double handful of chopped straw for every bucket of mix. The straw prevented shrinkage cracks. The sand prevented the clay from becoming too dense. Too much of either, and the blocks would fail under heat. The firebox is different, he said. The firebox sees flame. It needs hard-burned brick, kiln brick, not sun-dried. Your clay blocks are for the outer mass. They hold heat, but they cannot touch fire directly. Where do I get kiln brick? There is a brickworks south of Mandan. They sell seconds, bricks with cracks or chips that cannot be used for buildings. Those are good enough for a firebox, 100 bricks, maybe 140. That is what you need. Rosina did the math. Kiln brick, even seconds, cost money. She had $47.50, minus what she had already spent on rope and nails, and the flour that kept the children fed. How much? She asked. $3 a hundred, maybe $4. She could afford it. Barely. The foundation was finished on the 26th of October. 4 days of digging, hauling, and packing had turned the center of the cabin into a pit lined with field stone and broken rock, or tamped solid with a wooden mallet until Matias could jump on it without feeling any give. Now we build, he said. The first course of clay blocks went down on the 27th. Matias showed Rosina how to spread mortar, the same clay mix, but wetter, in a thin, even layer. How to set each block with a slight twist to seat it properly. How to check level after every third block and shim with fragments if the course was drifting. Plumb and level, he said. If the base is crooked, the whole structure will be crooked. And a crooked heater is a cracked heater. They worked in stages. 3 courses one day, 2 the next, then 3 more. The mass rose slowly from the floor, a white rectangle of clay blocks that smelled like river mud and looked like nothing else in Dakota territory. Marta learned to mix mortar. Ish Jakob learned to carry water without spilling. The family operated like a crew now, each person responsible for a piece of the work, no one standing idle while others labored. The first setback came on the 30th of October. A rain squall blew in from the northwest without warning. The canvas coverings on the drying bricks were not secured tightly enough. By the time Rosina reached them, 40 blocks were soaked through, their surfaces pocked with rain craters, their corners beginning to slump. She stood in the mud, watching the water drip from ruined clay, and felt the panic rise in her chest like a cold hand. Matias found her there. He looked at the damaged blocks. He did not curse or console. "How many do you have left?" he asked. 312 that are dry. There are maybe 40 more that need another week. How many do you need to finish? 580, you said. Matias nodded. He was quiet for a moment, calculating. Then you make more, he said. And you make them faster. The weather will not wait for you to feel ready. He helped her crush the ruined blocks back into workable clay. They mixed a fresh batch before sunset. The next morning, 60 new blocks were drying under canvas that Rosina had staked down with rocks at every corner. She did not sleep more than 4 hours a night for the next week. The hard-burned brick arrived on the 3rd of November. Rosina had gone to the brickworks herself, riding the mule 12 miles south while Marta watched Jacob and Matias continued laying the outer walls. She had argued with the foreman over price. He settled on $3.20 for 140 seconds and borrowed a cart from a farmer who owed Caspar a debt he had never repaid. The cart had a broken axle pin that she fixed with wire and prayer. The road back was rutted from recent rain. Twice she had to unload half the brick, push the cart through mud, and reload on the other side. She arrived at the cabin after dark, her clothes soaked with sweat despite the cold, her hands bleeding from lifting and stacking. Matias met her at the door with a lantern. You got them, he said. I got them. He looked at her hands. He looked at her face. He did not say anything about rest or limits or a woman's proper work. He simply nodded and helped her unload. The firebox went up over the next 5 days. This was different from the outer walls. The hard-burned brick had to be laid with precision. each course creating part of the combustion chamber, the throat, the first channels. Matias worked beside Rosina, showing her how to angle the throat so gases would rise properly, how to leave gaps for clean-out access, how to step the channel walls so heat would not rush through but would linger and surrender to the mass. "The fire wants to escape," he said. "Your job is to make it work before it leaves. Every turn in the channel is a chance to steal heat from the smoke. The longer the path, the more you steal." They built the first rising channel on the left side of the firebox. Exhaust would climb 6 feet, hit a cap of clay blocks, and turn 90 degrees into a horizontal run. From there, it would drop through a descending channel on the right side. You'd cross under the firebox through a lower passage, and finally rise to the chimney collar on the back wall. 28 feet of total path, 28 feet of brick and clay that would absorb heat before the smoke reached open air. "In the old country," Matias said, "we built heaters with channels 40 feet long. This is shorter, but it will work." Rosina traced the path with her finger, following the logic of it. The smoke entered hot. The smoke left cool, and everything the smoke surrendered stayed in the mass, waiting to become warmth. Merritt Yarrow returned on the 7th of November. He pulled his sled up to the cabin at midday, hauling a load of cordwood for another family. He had made a point of avoiding Rosina since their first conversation, but the heater had grown too large to ignore. He stood in the doorway and looked at the structure rising from the cabin floor. It was over 6 feet tall now, the outer walls complete, the internal channels visible through gaps that would soon be sealed. The white clay surface had been smoothed with wet hands until it shone faintly in the lamplight. "Good God," Merritt said. Rosina did not stop working. She was fitting the last course of blocks around the chimney collar, sealing the connection between mass and pipe. "Mrs. Turns," Merritt said, "what have you done?" "I built a heater." "You built a—" He searched for words. "A monument, a brick castle. You built something that belongs in a church, not a claim shanty." "It belongs here." Merritt walked around the structure. He put his hand on the clay surface. He peered into the firebox opening, on where the hard-burned brick waited for its first real fire. "Does it work?" he asked. "Not yet. We have to cure it first. Small fires over several days. Let the mortar dry slowly so it does not crack." "And if it does crack, then smoke fills the room and we start over." Merritt shook his head. He was not laughing anymore, but he was not convinced either. "I told you 8 cords," he said. "You have what? 2 cords stacked out there? Maybe 3? 2.5. That's not enough for a winter, not even with this thing. This thing will change the math." "Will it?" Merritt stepped closer. His voice dropped. "Mrs. Turns, I've seen a lot of people die on this frontier. Good people, smart people, people who thought they had figured out a way to beat the cold. The cold doesn't care how smart you are. The cold doesn't care how much work you put in. The cold kills, and it kills the stubborn ones hardest of all." He looked at the heater one more time. Then he looked at Rosina. "I hope I'm wrong," he said. "I hope this pile of mud does exactly what you think it will do. But I'm not going to stop being scared for your children until I see them alive in April." He walked out. The sled runners creaked as he pulled away. Matias, who had been watching from the corner, spoke quietly. "He's not wrong to be scared," he said. "This heater is not magic. It will not work if you fire it wrong. It will not save you if the chimney blocks or the draft fails. You must learn it the way you learn anything else, by doing it, by failing, by fixing." "I know." "Do you?" Matias set down his trowel. Because the part that comes next is the part where most people give up. The curing takes days. The first fires smoke and sputter. The chimney draws poorly until the mass is warm. You will think you have built a failure, and you will want to tear it down. You must not. Rosina looked at the heater. It was nearly complete, a whitewashed block of clay and brick that filled the center of her cabin and changed the shape of everything she knew. I won't tear it down, she said. Good. Matias picked up his trowel. Then let's finish the collar and start the first fire tomorrow. The curing fires began on the 9th of November. Matias showed her the rhythm. A small fire first, just chips and shavings, barely enough to warm the firebox. Let it burn for an hour. Let the smoke find its path through the channels. Let the draft establish itself, then let the mass cool overnight. The next day, a slightly larger fire, more chips, a few sticks of kindling, watch the smoke, listen to the draft, feel the chimney for warmth. Each day the fire grew. Each day the mass absorbed more heat. Each day Rosina learned to read the sounds and smells that meant the heater was working, the low hum of good draft, the clean scent of dry combustion, the warmth that lingered in the plaster hours after the flames died. By the 12th of November, she was burning small splits of cottonwood. The firebox glowed orange. The channels sang with moving air. And the wall nearest the bed held warmth that Rosina could feel through her palm at midnight. The children noticed first. Mama, Marta said one morning, I'm not cold. It was a simple statement. It was also the first confirmation that all the digging, all the hauling, all the sleepless nights had not been wasted. But Matias did not celebrate. A calm frost proves nothing, he said. The true test is different. A north wind, a full night, no mercy. That is when you will know if this heater works. He looked out the window. The sky was gray and still. The barometer on the shelf had been dropping for 2 days. It's coming, he said. Soon. The geese left on the 14th of November. Rosina watched them go, line after line, ragged V-shapes against a sky the color of old pewter. They did not circle or hesitate. They flew south as if something was chasing them, and when the last flock disappeared over the horizon, the silence that followed was deeper than any silence she had known. The temperature dropped 10 degrees that night. The wind shifted to the north. By morning, rime coated the inside of the windows, and Rosina's breath made clouds in the air until she fired the heater. She built the charge carefully, the way Matias had taught her. Chips first, then kindling, then 2 compact splits of cottonwood stacked tight against each other. She opened the damper fully. She lit the fire at the base of the pile. The flames caught. The fire roared, and for 15 minutes, the firebox blazed with an intensity that would have terrified her a month ago. Then the fire burned down. The flames faded. The coals settled into a glowing bed, and the sound shifted from roar to whisper as the heat moved into the channels. Rosina put her hand on the outer wall, warm, growing warmer. She checked the chimney collar. Inner cool smoke rising, not hot. The channels were doing their work, stealing heat from the exhaust, holding it in the mass instead of venting it to the sky. An hour later, the fire was dead. The firebox held only ash and fading coals, but the wall beneath Rosina's palm was warmer than it had been at the height of the burn. The heater was storing heat. The heater was working. She added a modest charge, chips, and 1 small split, and let it catch. The flames were quick and hot. When they died, the warmth deepened. For the first time since Kaspar's death, Rosina allowed herself to believe she might survive. Matias left on the morning of the 16th. His cough had been worsening for days, a deep, wet sound that came from somewhere below his ribs. He had not complained. He had not stopped working. Déjà but Rosina could see the effort it cost him to climb the ladder, to carry blocks, to speak for more than a few minutes without pausing for breath. "There are other families," he said. He was standing by his wagon, his coat buttoned to the throat, his face gray in the cold morning light. "Downstream. They need help before the worst of it comes. You should rest." "I've rested enough for one lifetime." He smiled. It was the first real smile she had seen from him, not worn thin, but warm and tired and true. "You know what to do now. The heater is sound. The channels are clear. Fire it hot, fire it short, and let the mass work." He handed her a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was a mason's trowel, worn smooth by decades of use, and a small notebook filled with cramped handwriting. "The trowel was my master's," he said. "The book is my own. Measurements, proportions, channel lengths. Everything I know about masonry heaters is in those pages." Rosina took the bundle. Her hands were shaking. "Why?" she asked. "Because you will build more of these," Matias said. "Not this winter. This winter you survive. But after. When the neighbors see that you lived and they want to know how, you will teach them, and you will need to remember what I showed you." He climbed onto the wagon. He gathered the reins. "Matias," Rosina said, "thank you." "Don't thank me." He looked back at her one last time. "Show me I was right about you." He clicked his tongue at the horse. The wagon rolled forward. Rosina watched until he disappeared into the gray distance, and then she went back inside to tend the fire. November 17th, 1886. The change came fast. By noon, the temperature had fallen 20 degrees. By mid-afternoon, the wind arrived, a hard, steady blow from the north that found every crack in the tar paper and drove cold through the cabin like water through a sieve. By dusk, the snow began, and within an hour, the world outside disappeared into a white roar of moving ice. Rosina checked the thermometer Beret had given her. 14 degrees at 4 o'clock, 8 degrees at 6. By 8 o'clock, the reading was below zero and still falling. She had 2.5 cords of wood stacked against the north wall of the cabin. She had 8 splits inside, dry and ready. She had 2 children bundled near the heater, watching their mother with eyes that understood more than she wanted them to understand. The iron stove sat cold in the corner. Fear she would not need it tonight. The heater would carry them, or it would fail, and nothing else would matter. She built the charge, chips first, a handful of dry shavings from the kindling pile, then 2 splits of cottonwood, dense and dry, placed tight against each other in the center of the firebox. She opened the damper. She lit the fire at the base. Nothing happened. The chips smoked. The shavings curled and blackened. But the flame did not catch. The draft did not pull. The chimney, still cold from the afternoon lull, refused to draw. Rosina felt the panic rise. She had seen this before. Matias had warned her about it. A cold chimney resisted draft. The air inside the flue was dense and heavy, blocking the rising smoke. The solution was simple, but you had to remember it when fear was clouding your mind. She grabbed a fistful of straw. She twisted it into a tight bundle. She lit the end and held it up to the throat of the firebox, where the first channel began. The straw burned hot and fast. The heat rose into the flue, warming the air, thinning it, creating the pressure difference that made draft possible. Within 30 seconds, the smoke began to pull. Within a minute, the chips caught. Within 3 minutes, the cottonwood splits were burning with a steady orange roar. Rosina pulled back. She closed the loading door. She adjusted the damper to 3/4 open and watched the fire through the small gap she left for observation. The flames grew. The sound changed from crackle to rumble to the low, steady hum that meant combustion was complete. The firebox glowed. The channels took the heat. Marta pressed her hand against the outer wall. "It's getting warm," she said. "Yes." "Will it stay warm?" Rosina looked at the fire. She looked at the snow driving against the window. She looked at her daughter's face, half lit by the glow from the firebox. "We're going to find out," she said. The first complication arrived at 9 o'clock. Someone was pounding on the door. Rosina opened it to find Beret Solheim standing in a wall of blowing snow, her youngest child wrapped in a blanket stiff with ice. Behind her, barely visible through the white, was the shadow of her ox standing head down against the wind. "My stove," Beret gasped. "The pipe. It won't draw. The fire keeps going out in the room." She could not finish the sentence. Her lips were blue. The child in her arms was 3 years old. His name was Peter, and he had been running a fever for 2 days. Now he was not moving at all, and his eyes were closed. Rosina did not hesitate. "Inside," she said. "Now." She pulled Beret through the door. She took the child and held him against the warm wall of the heater while Marta found blankets. She sent Jacob to the corner to boil water on the iron stove, which she lit for the first time that night. The cabin, which had held 3 people comfortably, now held 5. The warmth that had been ample for Rosina's family would have to stretch for Beret's as well, and the fire she had just charged would burn down within the hour. "How long?" Beret asked. She was shaking so hard her teeth clicked. "How long can this thing keep us warm?" Rosina looked at the heater. She looked at the child against the warm plaster. She looked at the window where the snow was piling against the glass and the wind was screaming like something alive. "I don't know," she said. "I've never tested it through a night like this." The hours that followed were the longest of Rosina's life. By 10 o'clock, the fire had burned down to coals. The firebox held only ash and glowing fragments. The flames were gone, the smoke was thinning, and the chimney was carrying away the last of the visible heat. Marta looked at her mother. Her face was pale in the lamplight. "Mama," she said, "the fire's out." "I know. Shouldn't you put more wood on?" "Not yet." Rosina put her hand on the wall. The plaster was warm, not hot, but warm, the kind of warmth that sinks into your palm and spreads through your bones. She moved to the other side of the heater, near the bed. Warm there, too. The channels were full of heat. The mass was charged. "We wait," she said. "We see what the brick gives back." The wind hammered the cabin. The temperature outside fell to 10 below, then 15, then 20. The newspaper in the wall cracks rustled and popped as the green lumber shrank in the cold. The tar paper hummed like a drumhead. But the room did not collapse into freezing darkness. At 11 o'clock, the wall was still warm. Peter's shivering had stopped, and his breathing had steadied. Beret sat beside him, her hand on his chest, counting each rise and fall. At midnight, Rosina checked the thermometer. The cabin was holding at 42 degrees, not comfortable, not safe for a long stay. But not death. She built a second charge, smaller than the first. Chips, shavings, one compact split. She lit it. You prime the draft with straw and let the flames run hot for 20 minutes. When the fire died, the wall temperature rose from warm to nearly hot. "I don't understand," Beret said. "The fire is out. Why is the wall getting warmer?" "The channels," Rosina said. "The smoke passes through before it leaves. The brick steals the heat and holds it. The fire is just the beginning. The brick is the rest." Beret stared at her. In the dim light, her expression shifted from confusion to something that might have been the first stirrings of belief. In Norway, she said slowly, my grandmother had a house with thick stone walls. When I was a child, I used to press my back against them on cold nights. They were always warm, even when the fire was out. Yes, I thought it was magic. It's not magic. It's mass. The more mass, the more heat it holds. The more heat it holds, the longer you stay alive. Outside, the wind did not relent, but inside, the children slept. At 2 a.m, the second complication hit. Rosina woke to a strange sound, a muffled thump from the direction of the chimney, followed by a hiss of smoke curling back through the clean-out port. She knew immediately what had happened. Snow had packed around the chimney collar outside, blocking the draft. The smoke that should have been rising into the sky was now backing up into the channels, looking for any exit it could find. If she did not clear it, the room would fill with smoke. The children would choke. Everything she had built would become a death trap. She pulled on her coat. She wrapped a scarf around her face. She told Beret to keep the children low to the floor, where the air was clearest. Then she opened the door and stepped into the storm. The wind hit her like a fist. The snow was horizontal, driving into her eyes, finding the gaps in her clothing, stealing heat from her body faster than she could replace it. She could not see the cabin wall from 3 feet away. She could barely see her own hands. She worked by memory. The chimney was on the back wall, 6 feet to the right of the door. She found it with her shoulder, felt the brick through her mittens, traced the line of it up to the collar where the clay blocks met the metal pipe. Snow, packed tight. A drift had climbed the north side of the cabin and buried the chimney opening under 2 feet of white. She dug with her hands. The mittens were useless for grip, so she pulled them off and dug barehanded, scooping snow away from the collar, clearing the opening, feeling the draft begin to pull again as the blockage broke. Her fingers went numb after 30 seconds. She kept digging. The pipe was clear. The snow fell away. Smoke began to rise, faint and gray against the white blur of the storm. She stumbled back to the door. She fell through it. She lay on the floor, gasping, while Beret pulled the door closed and Marta wrapped her hands in warm cloth. "Is it fixed?" Beret asked. Rosina nodded. She could not speak. Her fingers were white and stiff, and she knew she would pay for the next hour in pain as the blood returned. But the draft was pulling. The smoke was rising. The heater was still working. Dawn came gray and brutal. The storm had not stopped. The wind had not dropped. But the sky lightened from black to pewter. And through the gap in the clouds, Rosina could see that the world outside was still there, buried but present. The thermometer in the cabin read 38 degrees. The fire had been out for 4 hours, but the wall behind the bed was warm to the touch, and the children were sleeping under 1 blanket instead of 3. Beret was awake. She had not slept all night. She sat beside Petter, watching his chest rise and fall, and when Rosina came to check on them, she looked up with an expression that was equal parts exhaustion and wonder. "He's warm," Beret said. "He's been warm all night. I kept checking, kept putting my hand on his forehead, and he was always warm. The wall is warm. He's sleeping against the wall." "I know." Beret shook her head slowly. "Rosina, I owe you an apology. I thought this thing was foolishness. I thought you were killing your children to prove a point. I was wrong." Rosina sat down beside her. Her hands were still aching from the cold, and her legs were shaking from exhaustion. But the worst was over. She could feel it. The storm was breaking. "You weren't wrong to doubt," she said. "I doubted too, every day, every hour. I doubted until the first fire burned down and the walls stayed warm. But you built it anyway." "I had to build something." They sat in silence for a while. The wind was easing. The snow was thinning. Somewhere to the east, a thin line of gold was spreading along the horizon. The storm ended at noon. Rosina opened the door to a world transformed. The snow was waist-deep against the north wall and knee-deep everywhere else. The mule had survived the night in the lean-to, shivering but alive. The woodpile was still standing, buried under drifts, but standing. She waded through the snow to the woodpile. She counted the splits she could see. 2 cords, maybe a little more. She had burned 4 splits in the worst night she had ever faced, and she had kept 5 people alive for 12 hours. Merritt Yarrow's math had been simple. 1 cord per week, 8 cords for winter. By that calculation, she should have burned half a cord last night. She had burned 4 splits. The brick monster had worked. The second day brought visitors. Word had spread somehow, through the storm, through the cold, through the network of neighbors who checked on each other when the weather turned. The widow Turnez had kept her cabin warm through the worst night of November, with a fire that went out at midnight. Merritt Yarrow came first. Here he walked into the cabin without knocking, his face raw from wind and cold, his eyes scanning the room until they found the heater. He walked to it. He put his hand on the wall. He left it there for a long time. "How long since the last fire?" he asked. 6 hours. "And the wall is still warm?" "Yes." Merritt looked at Rosina. He looked at the children. He looked at Beret, still sitting beside her son, who was awake now and asking for food. "I counted wrong," he said. His voice was quiet. "I counted for iron. You built for brick." He did not apologize. He did not congratulate. But when he walked out of the cabin, his shoulders were different, lower, somehow, as if he had set down something heavy. Halliday's foreman arrived that afternoon. His name was Tom Jenks, and he had been riding the lines when the storm hit. For he had made it to the bunkhouse at Halliday's main camp, but the stove there, a big iron box that ate wood like a starving animal, had overheated, cracked along the weld, and started leaking smoke. By morning, the bunkhouse was cold, and 2 of the hands had frost-bitten fingers. Jenks had heard about the widow Turnez. He had come to see for himself. He stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, looking at the heater with an expression Rosina could not read. "Halliday says you built this yourself," he said. "With help. A man named Matias Heert taught me the method." "The Mennonite?" "Yes." Jenks walked around the heater. He touched the wall, the way everyone touched it, surprised, confused, unable to reconcile what they felt with what they expected. "We lost 4 cattle in the storm," he said. "Couldn't keep the barn warm enough. The hands are talking about quitting if the cold keeps up." "I'm sorry for your losses." "Are you?" Jenks looked at her directly. "Halliday's been trying to run you off this claim since your husband died. He told me you wouldn't make it through November." "He was wrong." "Yes, he was." Jenks put his hat back on. "I'm going to tell him what I saw here. I don't know what he'll do with that information, but I'm going to tell him." He walked out into the snow. Rosina watched him go, and she understood that something had shifted, not just in the cabin, but in the territory. The brick monster had a witness now. The story would spread. The 3rd day brought the first real test of Rosina's teaching. A family named Lundgren, 3 miles north, had lost their stovepipe to ice damage during the storm. Their cabin was cold, their fuel was low, and they had 2 children under the age of 5. The father, a man named Oscar, had walked through the snow to ask if Rosina knew any way to help. Rosina did not have the time or materials to build a full heater for the Lundgrens, but she remembered what Matias had said about smaller adaptations, ways to add mass to existing stoves, ways to extend flue paths, ways to steal heat from smoke even in modest structures. She walked to the Lundgren cabin with Oscar. She looked at their iron stove, their broken pipe, their inadequate fuel supply. She thought about the problem the way Matias had taught her to think, not what you wish you had, but what you can do with what you have. "We can't build a heater," she said, "but we can build a warming wall." She showed them how to stack clay blocks behind the stove, where the heat would radiate into them. She showed them how to extend the flue path through a simple brick maze before it reached the chimney. She showed them how to fire hot and short instead of low and long. It was not a masonry heater, it was a compromise. But when she left that evening, the Lundgren cabin was warmer than it had been since the storm began, and Oscar was looking at her the way people look at someone who knows something they need to learn. By the end of the week, the temperature had climbed above zero for the first time in 5 days. The snow was still deep, the wind still cut like a blade, but the worst of the storm was past. Rosina sat by the heater on the evening of November 22nd, watching the children sleep. The fire had been out for hours. The wall was warm. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of breathing. She thought about Casper. She thought about the tobacco tin with its $47. She thought about Merritt Yarrow's voice telling her that her children would freeze before Candlemas. She thought about Matias Heert, somewhere downstream, coughing in the cold, helping other families the way he had helped her. She put her hand on the warm plaster. She let the heat sink into her palm. The winter was not over. The hardest months were still coming, December, January, the long black nights of February. But she had faced the first real test, and she had not failed. The heater had held. The children had survived. And somewhere out in the territory, people were starting to ask questions about the widow Terns and her impossible brick machine. She closed her eyes, or she slept. The fire had gone out hours before, but the bricks were still giving back warmth that the winter tried to take. The days after the storm brought a parade of visitors that Rosina had not expected and could not turn away. They came singly at first, a neighbor here, a curious stranger there, and then in pairs and small groups, stamping snow from their boots and asking to see the heater that had kept 5 people alive through the worst night of November. Rosina showed them. She answered their questions. She put their hands against the warm plaster and watched their faces change. The validation came in layers, the way Matias had said it would. First, she confirmed it herself, tracking the fuel she burned against the warmth she held. Then neutral observers acknowledged it, people who had no stake in her success or failure, who simply saw what they saw and reported it honestly. And then, one by one, the skeptics began to break. Merritt Yarrow returned on the 25th of November. He came alone, without his sled, walking the 3 miles from his place through snow that was still knee-deep in the hollows. He arrived at Rosina's door in the middle of the afternoon, his face red from cold, his breathing heavy from the effort. "I want to see the channels," he said. Rosina let him in. She showed him the clean-out ports, the small openings Matias had insisted on, covered with fitted clay plugs that allowed access to the internal passages for cleaning and inspection. She pulled one plug and held a candle to the opening so Merritt could see the brick-lined channel inside. "The smoke comes up here," she said, pointing to the rising channel on the left. It hits the cap and turns. Then it drops through this side." She moved to the right, crosses under the firebox, and rises to the chimney. 28 feet of path before it leaves. Merritt studied the openings. He put his hand inside one channel and felt the residual warmth from the morning's fire. "How hot does it get?" he asked. "The firebox glows orange. The channels get hot enough to burn your hand if you're not careful, but by the time the smoke reaches the chimney, it's barely warm." "Because the brick takes the heat." "Yes." Merritt pulled his hand out. He stood up slowly, his joints creaking from the cold walk. He looked at the heater for a long time without speaking. I told you 8 cords, he finally said. I told you your children would freeze. And I told you to sell the mule and leave. You did. I've been cutting and hauling wood for 30 years. I thought I knew how heat worked. I thought a fire was a fire. You fed it. It burned. You fed it again. He shook his head. I was counting the wrong thing. He walked around the heater one more time, running his hand along the smooth plaster surface. My father built houses in Missouri, he said. Good houses, tight houses, but they all had iron stoves and they all ate wood like you wouldn't believe. He told me once that his grandfather's house in Pennsylvania had a different kind of stove, something the old Germans built, something that held heat in the walls. I thought he was telling stories. He wasn't telling stories. No. Merritt looked at her, but his expression was different now, not the pity and contempt of their first meeting, but something closer to respect. He was telling me about this. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the latch. I told you 8 cords stacked and that you'd freeze without them, he said. Now I've seen another price paid instead. Labor, clay, nerve. I was wrong about the arithmetic, and I'm not too proud to say so. He opened the door. The cold air rushed in. If you ever need help hauling wood, he said, you come find me. I owe you that much for being a fool. He walked out into the snow. Rosina watched him go, and she understood that something had changed in the territory, not just one man's opinion, but the beginning of a shift in what people believed was possible. Beret Solheim's conversion was quieter, but it ran deeper. She had stayed at Rosina's cabin for 3 days after the storm, nursing Pater back to health against the warm wall of the heater. When she finally returned to her own place, her first act was to examine her iron stove with new eyes, seeing not a heat source, but a heat waste. She came back a week later with questions. How thick do the walls need to be? She asked. Could I build something smaller? Something that fits in the corner instead of the middle? What about the weight? My floor is planks, not dirt. Would it hold? Rosina answered each question carefully. She drew sketches on scraps of paper. She explained the principles Matias had taught her: mass, channel length, hot fast fires instead of slow smoky ones. I can't build you a full heater, she said. I don't have the time or the brick. No, but I can show you how to add mass to what you have. A brick wall behind your stove, a longer flue path, small changes that make a difference. Will you show me? Yes. They spent 2 days at Beret's cabin, working together. Rosina taught the way Matias had taught her, through action, through demonstration, through letting Beret make mistakes and then correcting them. They built a simple warming wall from clay blocks, stacked 3 feet high behind the iron stove. They extended the flue path with a horizontal run of salvaged brick before it turned up to the chimney. When they finished, Beret fired her stove the old way, low and slow, feeding it constantly. The room warmed, but the warmth faded quickly when the fire died. Then Rosina showed her the new way. Hot and fast. Let the flames roar. Let the stove glow orange. Then stop. Let the mass take over. An hour after the fire died, Beret put her hand on the warming wall. It's still warm, she said. Her voice was soft, almost reverent. The stove is cold, but the wall is still warm. That's the difference. That's the difference. Beret looked at Rosina. I doubted you. I told you this was foolishness. I told you that you were gambling with your children's lives. You weren't wrong to doubt. You were scared for me. I was scared for you. But I should have trusted that you knew something I didn't. Beret took Rosina's hands. Her grip was firm. You saved my son. You kept him warm when my house couldn't. I won't forget that. You would have done the same for me. I would have tried, but I wouldn't have known how. The community questions multiplied through December. A family named Asen, is she 4 miles south, wanted to know if the method would work with lignite instead of wood. Rosina told them yes. Lignite burned hot and fast, which was exactly what the heater needed. She walked them through the firing rhythm, the damper settings, the signs of good draft versus poor. A widow named Christy Flatten, living alone on a quarter section near the breaks, wanted to know if she could build a heater without help. Rosina told her the truth. The work was hard, and the weight was dangerous if you didn't lay the foundation properly. But with careful planning and a strong back, it could be done. She gave Christy a copy of the measurements from Matias's notebook. A young couple named the Espelants, newly married and just starting their first winter in a claim shanty even smaller than Rosina's, wanted to know if there was anything they could do with no brick at all, just clay and the materials they could find along the river. Rosina showed them how to build a simple clay bench that absorbed heat from their stovepipe, how to bank the outside walls with sod and straw, how to fire their iron stove in short, hot bursts instead of endless smoky smolders. Each teaching session reinforced what Rosina knew. Each question forced her to think through the principles again, to find words for knowledge that had lived in her hands and her memory. She was becoming what Matias had said she would become, a teacher, a source, someone others sought when the old methods failed. But Halliday had not converted, and Halliday was still watching. Dexter Halliday's reaction to the storm was not repentance but calculation. He had lost cattle. He had lost face. His foreman had visited the widow Turns and come back with a report that made Halliday look like a fool for dismissing her work. The brick monster had survived the worst night of November, and now people were talking about it in terms that Halliday did not like. His first move was to minimize. One storm proves nothing, he told the men at the general store in Mandan. She got lucky. The cold will come back. And when it does, that pile of mud will crack and she'll be right back where she started. His second move was to undermine. He spread word that Rosina's heater was dangerous, that the channels trapped smoke, that the mass could collapse without warning, that anyone who built one was risking their family's lives. The rumors had just enough technical language to sound credible, even though Halliday had never set foot inside her cabin or examined the construction. His third move was to isolate. He told the merchants in Mandan that anyone who extended credit to the widow Turnez was extending credit against Halliday's interests. He did not threaten directly. He was too careful for that, but the implication was clear. Help her, and you make an enemy of the biggest cattle operation in the territory. Rosina heard about all of it. The gossip traveled fast on the plains, carried by the same neighbors who came to learn from her. She did not respond publicly. She did not confront Halliday. She simply kept teaching, kept demonstrating, kept putting hands against warm walls and letting the evidence speak for itself. The evidence was hard to argue with. By the end of December, 4 families had built some version of the warming wall she had shown Beret. 2 more were planning full heaters for the following summer, and Merritt Yarrow, who had once told her she would freeze before Candlemas, was now telling anyone who would listen that the widow Ternez had figured out something the rest of them had missed. Halliday's rumors could not compete with warm hands on warm plaster, but he was not finished. He was simply waiting for another chance. Matias Heert returned in the first week of January. He came up the river road on a gray afternoon, his wagon moving slowly, his horse picking its way through the packed snow. Rosina saw him from the rise where she was stacking wood, not much wood, but enough to last the month if she was careful, and she felt her heart lift and sink at the same time. He looked older. All the weeks since November had carved new lines into his face, and his shoulders had a hunch that had not been there before. When he climbed down from the wagon, he moved like a man counting the cost of each step. "You survived," he said. "I survived." "I heard." He smiled. It was thin, but it was real. "They're talking about you in every settlement from here to Bismarck. The widow who built a brick monster and made one log last 2 days. That's not exactly what happened." "No, but that's how stories work. The truth gets simplified until it fits in a sentence." He looked at the cabin, at the smoke rising from the chimney in a thin gray line. "Show me." She took him inside. She showed him the heater, now darkened by months of use, its surface smooth and warm under the hand. She showed him the firing log she had kept on the wall, each burn recorded with a charcoal mark, fuel in and warmth out, a visible record of the new arithmetic. Matias studied the logs. He ran his hand along the channel walls, checking for cracks. He examined the firebox, the throat, the clean-out ports. He did not speak for a long time. "You've kept it well," he finally said. "The mortar is holding. The draw is clean. You've learned the rhythm." "I had a good teacher." "You had a teacher who showed you the first steps. You learned the rest yourself." He turned to face her. "That's the difference between someone who follows instructions and someone who understands the work." They sat by the heater while the afternoon light faded. Matias told her about the families he had helped downstream, a bake oven for one, a heating bench for another, a full masonry heater for a church that had been losing the battle against cold every winter since it was built. His cough was worse, but his pride was evident. He had done good work. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. His voice had changed, quieter, more careful. "I don't have many winters left. The cough is not going away. The cold makes it worse. By next November, I may not be able to travel." Rosina did not speak. She did not trust herself to speak. "I came back because I wanted to see what you built," Matias continued, "and because I wanted to finish what I started. You know the method now, but there are things I haven't shown you, variations, adaptations, the tricks that make the difference between a heater that works and a heater that sings. You're going to teach me more." "Yes, while I still can." He looked at her directly, his eyes clear despite the weariness in his face. "And then you're going to teach others. That's how the knowledge survives. Not in books, not in drawings, in hands that know the work." They spent the next 3 weeks working together. Matias taught her the variations he had mentioned, a smaller channel design for narrow cabins, a cooking surface that could be integrated into the upper mass, a drying shelf for wet clothes and boots that used waste heat from the chimney collar. He showed her how to read cracks in the mortar, how to patch them before they spread, how to know when a heater was failing before it actually failed. They argued about the bake oven. Rosina wanted to add one to her heater, a small chamber above the firebox where bread could rise and bake using residual heat. Matias said the modification was too complex for her current structure, that it would require rebuilding the upper channels and risking the integrity of the whole. "The heater works," he said. "You don't change something that works just because you want more." "But the families who come to learn, they ask about baking. They want to know if they can have both." "Then show them how to build a separate bake oven. Don't corrupt a good heater with unnecessary complications." "It's not unnecessary if it gives them more from the same fuel." The argument went back and forth for 2 days. They sketched competing designs on scraps of paper. They measured and calculated and argued about channel lengths and heat distribution. In the end, they compromised. Matias showed her how to build a small bread chamber into a new heater, not a modification of the existing one, but a design for future builds. The chamber would sit above and behind the main firebox, fed by a secondary channel that captured heat that would otherwise go directly to the chimney. "This is for the next generation," he said. Not for this one. Build your next heater with the chamber. Prove it works, then teach it to others. I will. I know you will. He set down his charcoal. That's why I'm telling you. Matias left on the 28th of January. His cough had worsened despite the warm cabin, despite the rest, despite Rosina's attempts to keep him fed and comfortable. He said there was a family downstream that needed help, a young couple with a sick child, no heating solution, no one else to turn to. He said he would be back in the spring, when the roads were clear and the weather was easier. Rosina knew he was lying. She could see it in the way he avoided her eyes, in the careful way he packed his tools, in the long silence before he climbed onto the wagon. "Matias," she said. He stopped. He did not turn around. "Thank you." "Don't thank me." His voice was rough. "Remember what I taught you. Pass it on. That's the only thanks I want." He clicked his tongue at the horse. The wagon rolled forward, slow and steady, down the river road toward the gray horizon. Rosina watched until he disappeared. She stood in the cold until her feet went numb and the sun dropped below the edge of the world. Then she went inside. She sat by the heater. She put her hand on the warm plaster. She did not cry. Well, there was too much work to do for crying. The news came in late February. A rider from the downstream settlement brought it. Matias Heert had died in his sleep on the 14th, in the cabin of the family he had gone to help. He had finished their heater 2 days before. He had fired it himself, checking the draw, adjusting the damper, making sure everything was right. Then he had gone to bed and not woken up. The family said he looked peaceful. They said the cabin was warm. Rosina received the news standing at her door, her children watching from behind her, the winter wind cutting through the gap. She thanked the rider. She closed the door. She sat down at the table and put her head in her hands. She stayed that way for a long time. That evening, she opened Matias's notebook. She read through the pages slowly, the cramped handwriting, the careful measurements, the sketches of channel layouts and firebox proportions. At the back of the book, she found a page she had not seen before. It was a letter, addressed to her. Rosina, if you are reading this, I am gone. Do not mourn too long. I had a good life, and I ended it doing work that mattered. You have everything you need now. The knowledge is in your hands and your head. The rest is practice. Build more heaters. Teach more people. When the cold comes, let them warm themselves against walls that remember fire. That is how we survive, not alone, but together. Your friend, Matias Heert. She folded the letter. She put it back in the notebook. She closed the cover. Then she went to the heater and built a fire, a proper fire, hot and fast, the way he had taught her. She let the flames roar. She watched the channels take the heat. She felt the mass begin to warm. The fire burned down. The flames faded, but the warmth remained, steady and patient, giving back what had been given. Outside, the wind was rising. Another storm was coming, but the cabin was warm and the children were safe. And somewhere in the territory, a heater Matias had built with his last strength was keeping another family alive. That was his legacy. That was what he had given her. She would not waste it. The secondary crisis came in the first week of March. A line of shanties north of the settlement, 5 families, 23 people, had been relying on a wagon of freighted coal that never arrived. The freighter's wagon had broken down 60 miles east. And by the time replacement transport was arranged, the coal would not reach them for another 2 weeks. 2 weeks was too long. The temperatures were dropping again. The families had burned through their wood reserves in February, and the riverbank deadfall was picked clean. 3 of the 5 cabins had small children. One had an elderly grandmother who could not walk without help. The word reached Rosina through Beret, who had heard it from the Peterson boy, who had heard it from his father. By the time the message arrived, 2 days had already passed, and the families were burning furniture to stay warm. Rosina did not hesitate. She gathered what she could carry: clay, tools, the measurements from Matias's notebook. She hitched the mule to the small sled she had borrowed from Merritt Yarrow. She left Marta in charge of the cabin, back with strict instructions about firing the heater and watching Jakob. Then she went north. The situation was worse than she expected. The 5 families were clustered along a shallow creek, their cabins built close together for mutual support. That proximity had helped them survive previous winters. They could share food, share labor, share warmth when things got desperate. But this year, the shared crisis had become a shared collapse. The Haugen cabin, the largest of the 5, had an iron stove that was cracked along the firebox and leaking smoke into the room. The family, a father, mother, and 3 children, had been sleeping in shifts, one person always awake to watch the fire and open the door when the air got too thick. The Tivate cabin, the smallest, had no stove at all. The elderly grandmother, Ragna Tivate, was wrapped in every blanket the family owned, sitting as close to a tin bucket of coals as she could manage without catching fire. The other 3 cabins were variations on the same desperate theme: inadequate heating, inadequate fuel, inadequate time. Rosina looked at the 5 families gathered in the Haugen cabin. She looked at the fuel they had left: a few sticks of furniture, some fence posts, a pile of dried manure that would burn hot but fast. She looked at the faces of the children, pinched and pale in the cold light. She did not have time to build 5 heaters. She did not have brick for even one. But she had clay, and she had knowledge, and she had 2 weeks before the coal arrived. "I can help," she said, "but you have to work with me, all of you." The next 14 days were the hardest of Rosina's life since the November storm. She organized the families into work teams. The men dug clay from the creek bank, the same river clay she had used for her own heater, dense and heavy, and good for holding heat. The women mixed mortar and shaped blocks, working in the Haugen cabin, where the cracked stove at least provided some warmth. The older children hauled water and sand. The younger children stayed wrapped in blankets, watching. Rosina moved from cabin to cabin, assessing each one, designing solutions that fit the specific conditions. Full heaters were impossible. There was no time to cure the clay properly, no hard-burned brick for the fireboxes, no foundation work that could be completed before the temperatures dropped again. But warming walls were possible. Key extended flue paths were possible. Heat capture benches, simple clay structures that sat beside existing stoves and absorbed radiant warmth were possible. She taught as she worked. She showed the Haugen family how to patch their cracked stove with clay and iron strapping, extending its life until they could afford a replacement. She showed the Tivate family how to build a small clay bench around their tin bucket, creating a mass that would hold heat long after the coals faded. She showed the others how to fire hot and fast, how to read draft by sound, how to know when a fire was ready to charge the mass. The work was exhausting. She slept 3 hours a night, sometimes less. Her hands cracked and bled from the cold and the clay. She lost weight she could not afford to lose, but the temperatures held. The jury-rigged heating solutions held. And on the 11th day, a breakthrough came. The Haugen family's warming wall was finished, a simple structure 3 feet high and 2 feet deep, built from clay blocks and positioned behind their patch stove. Rosina fired the stove hot, hotter than the family had ever dared, and let the heat pour into the wall. 2 hours later, the fire was down to coals. The stove was cooling, but the wall was warm. "Feel it," Rosina said to the Haugen children. "Put your hands on it." They did. Their faces changed. The youngest, a boy of 5, pressed his whole body against the warm clay and refused to move. "It's warm," he said. "It's still warm." "Yes." "How is it warm? The fire is out." "The brick remembers," Rosina said. "The fire gives it heat, and the brick holds it. And then the brick gives it back. That's the secret." The boy looked at her with eyes that understood more than his words could express. "Can we keep it?" he asked. "Yes, you can keep it." The coal arrived on the 14th day. By then, all 5 cabins had some form of heat mass system. Crude, improvised, nowhere near as efficient as Rosina's own heater, but enough to reduce the fuel they burned by 1/3 or more. The families had survived. The children had survived. Ragna Tveit, the elderly grandmother who had been huddled over a bucket of coals, was now sleeping beside a clay bench that stayed warm for hours after each firing. The freighter who delivered the coal looked at the clay structures in each cabin with confusion. "What the hell is all this?" he asked. "Heat storage," Rosina said. "Fire charges the mass. Mass releases the heat slowly. You burn less fuel." "Where'd you learn that?" "A man named Matias Heert taught me, and his teacher taught him, and so on, back to the old country." The freighter shook his head. He had been hauling coal and wood across the territory for 15 years, and he had never seen anything like it. "Lady," he said, "you should charge money for this." "I should," Rosina agreed, "but not yet. Not until everyone who needs it has a chance to learn." She packed her tools. She hitched the mule. She headed south, toward her own cabin, where Marta and Jacob were waiting. Behind her, the 5 families watched her go. The Haugen father raised his hand in farewell. The Tveit grandmother, standing in her doorway for the first time in weeks, waved a thin arm. Rosina did not look back, or there was too much work ahead to spend time looking back. The spring came early that year. By mid-March, the snow was melting. By April, the rivers were running high with snowmelt, and the ground was soft enough for plowing. The crisis of winter faded into memory, replaced by the crisis of planting, seeds to be sown, fences to be mended, animals to be fed and tended after months of deprivation. But the memory of the heater did not fade. People talked. They visited Rosina's cabin and put their hands on the warm wall that still held heat from the morning fire. They asked questions. They took measurements. They made plans for the coming summer, when the clay would be easy to dig and the blocks would dry quickly in the sun. Rosina found herself at the center of a web of requests. Families wanted her to advise their builds. Neighbors wanted to borrow her tools. Young men wanted to apprentice, to learn the method and carry it to other settlements. She said yes to all of it. She remembered what Matias had written. "That is how we survive, not alone, but together." Halliday watched the spreading influence with growing alarm. His attempts to undermine Rosina's reputation had failed. His warnings about danger and collapse had been proven wrong. The brick monster was no longer a joke. It was a model, a method, a challenge to everything he had assumed about who belonged on this land. He began to calculate differently. If he could not stop the method from spreading, perhaps he could co-opt it. Perhaps he could claim credit or profit, or at least neutralize the threat by making it his own. He sent his foreman to Rosina with an offer. Build heaters for Halliday's line camps, and Halliday would pay her well. The offer came with an implication: accept his money, and she would be under his patronage. Refuse, and he would find other ways to make her life difficult. Rosina refused. "Tell Mr. Halliday that I don't build for people who try to run me off my land," she said. "Tell him that if he wants a heater, he can learn to build one himself." The foreman left with the message. Rosina knew there would be consequences. She did not care. She had survived the worst winter of her life. She had kept her children alive. She had learned a skill that others needed, Halliday could wait. The work could not. The summer of 1887 brought the first full-scale building season. Rosina had spent the spring planning, wherein she had walked the claims within 10 miles of her cabin, assessing which families needed heaters most urgently and which had the resources to help build them. She had inventoried the clay deposits along the river, marking the best sites and calculating how many blocks each could yield. She had copied the essential measurements from Matias's notebook onto sheets of paper that could be distributed to learners. Now the work began. The first new heater went up on the Solheim claim, where Beret had insisted on replacing her improvised warming wall with a proper central mass. Rosina supervised the build, but Beret did most of the labor herself, digging the foundation pit, mixing the clay, laying the blocks course by course. Two of Beret's grown sons came home from the railroad to help with the heavy lifting, and by the end of June, a whitewashed heater stood in the center of Beret's cabin, smaller than Rosina's but built to the same principles. The firing test came on a cool evening in early July. Beret loaded the firebox with chips and kindling and 2 compact splits. She opened the damper. She lit the fire. The flames caught. The draft pulled. The channels filled with heat. An hour later, the fire was dead and the wall was warm. Beret put her hand on the plaster and laughed, a sound Rosina had not heard from her since the November storm. "It works," Beret said. "I built it, and it works. You built it. With your help. My help was showing you what to do. Your hands did the rest." The second heater went up on the Aslac claim 3 miles south. The third went up on a quarter section near the ferry crossing. Built by a family of German Russians who recognized the design from their own grandparents' stories. The fourth and fifth went up in August, supervised by Rosina, but constructed almost entirely by the families themselves. By September, 7 new heaters stood in the territory around Mandan. Each one was slightly different, adapted to the cabin size, the available materials, the specific needs of the family. But each one followed the principles Matias had taught: central placement, hot, fast fires, long channel paths, mass that held heat and released it slowly. People stopped calling them brick monsters. They started calling them Turnez heaters. Aslac Quam arrived in the territory that same summer. He was Norwegian, 43 years old, a widower whose wife had died in childbirth 3 years earlier. He had worked as a blacksmith in Minnesota before the grief drove him west, looking for land and solitude, and something to do with his hands that did not remind him of the life he had lost. He set up his forge on a quarter section 6 miles east of Rosina's claim, near a creek that provided water for quenching and a stand of cottonwood that provided fuel for his fires. Within a month, he had more work than he could handle. Farmers needed tools repaired, horses needed shoes, wagons needed iron fittings. Rosina met him in September, when she needed damper slides for the Asen heater. The damper was a critical component, a sliding iron plate that controlled airflow through the channels, allowing the operator to adjust how much heat escaped and how much was retained. Matias had shown her the design, but she did not have the skills to forge iron herself. She rode to Aslac's forge on a clear autumn morning, carrying Matias's notebook with the measurements and a rough sketch of what she needed. Aslac was working at his anvil when she arrived, hammering a piece of bar stock into a hinge. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with hands that looked like they had been shaped by the same forces that shaped the iron he worked. He did not stop hammering when she approached. "Mr. Quam," she said. He looked up. His face was weathered and serious, with deep-set eyes that measured her without speaking. "I need damper slides," she said, "for a masonry heater, 3 inches by 6 inches, with a 1/2-inch lip on one side for seating. I have measurements." She held out the notebook. Aslac set down his hammer and took it. He studied the sketch for a long time, turning the page to look at the related diagrams, the channel layouts, the cleanout ports, the firebox dimensions. "You're the widow Tyrnez," he said. "I am. I've heard about your heaters." He handed back the notebook. "People say they keep cabins warm with half the wood an iron stove needs." "Less than half, if they're built right." "And you build them yourself." "I supervise, I teach. The families do most of the labor." Aslac nodded slowly. He picked up the bar stock he had been working and examined it, turning it in his hands. "I can make your damper slides," he said. 3 days, $1 each plus materials." "That's fair. I have a question first." He set down the iron and looked at her directly. "The clean-out ports in your design, they need covers, fitted plates that seal tight but lift off for inspection. How have you been making those?" "Clay plugs, shaped to fit, dried in place." "Clay cracks, iron holds." "Iron costs money. Iron lasts." Aslac picked up a piece of scrap from his workbench, a flat rectangle with rounded edges. "If I made iron covers for the clean-out ports, fitted to the channel dimensions, how much would you pay?" Rosina studied the scrap. It was exactly the kind of cover she had wished for, something permanent, something that would not crack or crumble or need replacing every season. "How much would you charge?" she asked. $1 each, same as the dampers." "I can't afford that for every heater I build." "Then we make a different arrangement." Aslac set down the scrap. His expression had not changed, but something in his voice had shifted. "I make the iron work. You teach me the method. When I understand how the heaters work, I offer both services together, masonry and metal. We split the profit." Rosina stared at him. It was not the offer she had expected. "You want to learn to build heaters?" "I want to understand what I'm fitting iron to. A blacksmith who doesn't understand the work is just a hired hand. A blacksmith who understands is a partner." "I don't need a partner." "You need iron work. I need work that matters." Aslac picked up his hammer again. "Think about it. Come back in 3 days for your damper slides. Tell me what you decide." She thought about it. She thought about it while she walked the claim, checking the woodpile, watching the children play in the September grass. She thought about it while she fired the heater in the evening, listening to the familiar sounds of draft and combustion. She thought about it while she lay awake at night, her hand on the warm wall, her mind turning over the possibilities. Matias had worked alone most of his life. He had taught her, but he had not taken a partner. The knowledge had lived in his hands and his head, and when he died, most of it died with him. Only the fraction he had passed to Rosina survived. If she worked alone, the same thing would happen. She would teach what she could, build what she could, and eventually the knowledge would fade. The notebook would become a relic. The heaters would crumble and not be replaced. But if she worked with someone else, someone who could forge the iron she could not forge, someone who could take the method further than she could take it alone, the knowledge might survive longer. It might spread further. It might become something that outlasted both of them. She went back to Aslac's forge on the 3rd day. "I'll teach you," she said, "but not for profit. I don't sell the method, I give it away. If you learn it, you give it away too." "Then what do I get?" "Work, good work. Work that matters, like you said." She held out her hand. "And a partner who knows what she's doing." Aslac looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He did not smile, but something in his expression eased. He shook her hand. "Show me," he said. They built their first heater together in October, on a claim near the breaks where a young couple had just arrived from Wisconsin. Rosina supervised the masonry. Aslac forged the ironwork, damper slides, clean-out covers. a chimney collar reinforced with iron strapping. They argued about placement. They debated channel length. They disagreed about the proper ratio of sand to clay and had to test both versions before Rosina admitted that Aslac's mixture held up better under heat stress. The heater went up in 3 weeks. The couple fired it on the first cold night of November, and the warmth held through the dawn. Aslac put his hand on the wall and kept it there for a long time. "This is better than iron," he said. "Iron takes heat and gives it back too fast. This," he pressed his palm against the warm plaster, "this remembers. That's the secret. The fire is quick. The mass is slow. You need both. You need both." He looked at her. "I understand now why you give it away, why you don't charge." "Tell me." "Because charging creates scarcity, and scarcity kills." He took his hand off the wall. "If people have to pay for warmth, some of them won't be able to afford it, and those people will freeze. But if warmth is knowledge, and knowledge is free, then everyone can learn it. Everyone can survive." Rosina nodded. It was not exactly how she would have said it, but it was true. "Matias taught me," she said. "He asked one thing in return that I pass it on. I'm asking you the same thing." "Then I accept." They shook hands again. This time, Aslac almost smiled. Halliday's defeat came in December. The winter of 1887 was not as brutal as the year before, but it was cold enough, and Halliday's operations, stretched thin by the previous year's cattle losses, could not afford another season of frozen line camps and cracked stovepipes. He sent his foreman to Rosina with a different message this time. Not an offer, a request. "Mr. Halliday needs a heater," the foreman said. He stood in Rosina's doorway, hat in hand, unable to meet her eyes. "The main line camp. The stove gave out last week. The hands are threatening to quit if they have to spend another night in the cold." Rosina did not respond immediately. She let the silence stretch. "Mr. Halliday called my work a brick monster," she finally said. "He told me I was burying heat in mud. He said when I abandoned this claim, he'd use my bricks to line a cattle trough." "I know what he said." "He also tried to cut off my credit. He told the merchants in Mandan not to help me. He spread rumors that my heaters were dangerous." "I know. And now he wants my help." The foreman looked at the floor. He had worked for Halliday for 8 years, and he knew exactly what kind of man his employer was. But he also knew that the line camp was freezing, and the hands were serious about quitting, and if they quit, Halliday's operation would collapse. "Yes," he said. "He wants your help." Rosina let him stand there for another long moment. Then she stepped aside. "Tell Mr. Halliday I'll build his heater," she said. "But I have terms." "Name them." "First, he pays. Not just for my labor, for the materials, the ironwork, and a fair wage for my time. $20 for the complete job." "Done." "Second, he guarantees access to deadfall along the river strip for every widow with a claim in this territory. No more turning them away. No more charging them for what the land provides." The foreman hesitated. But this was a concession Halliday would hate. It meant giving up control of the timber that he had used as leverage against the homesteaders for years. "I'll have to ask him," the foreman said. "Ask him, but tell him if he refuses, his hands can freeze. I have other work to do." The foreman left. He returned the next day with Halliday's answer. "He agrees," the foreman said. "All of it. The money and the timber access." "In writing." "He'll put it in writing. Then we have a deal." Rosina built Halliday's heater in the second week of December. She brought Aslac to forge the ironwork. She brought Beret to help with the masonry. She did not bring the children. She did not want them anywhere near Halliday's property, but she brought a sense of purpose that carried her through 2 weeks of hard labor in hostile territory. Though Halliday himself appeared on the final day, when the heater was complete and the first curing fires were burning. He rode up on his horse, dismounted slowly, and walked into the line camp without greeting anyone. He looked at the heater for a long time. He did not touch it. He did not speak. Finally, he turned to Rosina. "You won," he said. "I survived." "Same thing, out here." He pulled an envelope from his coat. $20, as agreed. She took the envelope. She did not count the money. "The timber access agreement," she said. "Where is it?" Halliday produced a second piece of paper, folded and sealed. He handed it to her without comment. Rosina broke the seal and read. The language was formal, but the meaning was clear. Any widow with a homestead claim in the territory had the right to gather deadfall from the river strip at no cost, and with no interference from Halliday or his men. She folded the paper and put it in her coat. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me." Halliday's voice was flat, empty of the contempt that had once filled it. "I'm not doing this because I respect you. I'm doing this because I have no choice." "I know. I'm also doing it because I don't want to freeze." He looked at the heater one more time. "You were right. I was wrong. That doesn't mean I like you." "I don't need you to like me. I just need you to keep your word." Halliday climbed back onto his horse. He gathered the reins. "Mrs. Turns," he said, "if you ever decide to sell this method instead of giving it away, come see me. Heck, I'll pay you more than anyone else in the territory." "I won't sell." "I know." For just a moment, something that might have been respect flickered across his face. "That's why you won." He rode away. Rosina watched him go. Then she went back to work. The years that followed compressed into a rhythm of seasons and labors. Rosina and Aslac married in the spring of 1889, 3 years after the first heater went up. The wedding was small, just the two families and a few neighbors who had become friends. Marta, now 11, stood as witness. Jakob, 8, carried the ring. They did not merge their claims. They did not combine their households. Instead, they built a new cabin on the boundary line between their properties, a larger structure, designed from the start to hold a masonry heater with a bake oven integrated into the upper mass. It was the first of Matias's advanced designs that Rosina had built, and it worked exactly as he had predicted. The years brought children, a daughter named Sigri after Aslac's mother, a son named Matias after the man who had taught Rosina everything she knew. They grew up in a cabin that was always warm, in a territory that was slowly learning to stay warm alongside them. The years brought expansion. By 1892, 37 Tiern's heaters stood in the region around Mandan. By 1896, the number had doubled. Rosina and Aslac could not build all of them. There was too much demand, and they were only 2 people, but they taught others who taught others, who taught others still. The years brought loss. Beret Solheim died in 1894 of a fever that no warmth could cure. Merritt Yarrow passed in 1900, quietly, in a cabin warmed by a heater he had helped build after years of refusing to admit he needed one. The territory changed around them. Railroads came, towns grew, the open range closed. But the heaters remained, whitewashed monuments to knowledge that had crossed an ocean and survived. Marta became a school teacher. She married a man from Bismarck and moved east. But she came home every winter to visit, and she always put her hand on the warm wall of her mother's heater before she left. Jakob stayed. He learned the trade from his mother and stepfather, and by the time he was 20, he was building heaters on his own, adapting the designs for new materials, new structures, new challenges that Matias could never have imagined. He married a woman named Eli, had 3 children, and built a cabin less than a mile from the one where he was raised. Rosina grew old. Her hands stiffened, her back bent, but she never stopped teaching. Even in her final years, when she could no longer lift a brick or mix a batch of mortar, she could still put her hand on a warm wall and tell a young builder exactly what was wrong with their channel spacing. Rosina Ternes died on the 14th of March, 1912. She was 77 years old. She had outlived 2 husbands, 1 mentor, and most of the neighbors who had doubted her in that first desperate winter. She died in the cabin she had shared with Aslac, in the bed that sat against the warm wall of the heater she had designed and he had helped her build. Says the heater was warm when she closed her eyes. The heater was still warm when they carried her out. Within 2 townships, 17 families had learned some version of Rosina Ternes's method by the time of her death. Some had built full central heaters. Others had built smaller channel stoves adapted to narrow claim shanties. The most concrete sign of spread was the language people used. They stopped calling them brick monsters, stopped calling them Ternes heaters, and started simply calling them heaters as if no other kind existed, as if the iron stoves that had once dominated the plains had become the strange exception rather than the rule. One settler, a man named Gunder Lunde, who had learned from Rosina in 1893, copied her habit of marking firing cycles and fuel use directly on the wall beside his heater. His children found the marks decades later, faded but legible, a visible record of warmth turned into arithmetic. Rosina lived out her life on the same Dakota ground she had nearly lost in her first winter alone. She married Aslac Quam only after the work had already bound them, and in later years they were known less as a romantic pair than as the people who could make a house livable with clay, brick, and good judgment. She never left the territory. She never wanted to. On the morning of the day she died, she asked Jakob to help her to the heater. She put her hand on the wall, the same wall she had touched 10,000 times, in 10,000 different seasons, and she kept it there for a long time. "Still warm," she said. It was the last clear thing she said. Return now to November 17th, 1886, and the wind from the north, hard and unrelenting, the temperature falling 40 degrees in a single day, the claim shanty with its tar paper walls and green lumber already shrinking in the cold. Merritt Yarrow, who had cut and freighted wood through 24 Missouri winters, had stood in Rosina's doorway and delivered his verdict. His voice had been calm, certain, the voice of a man who had watched people die from bad arithmetic. "Without 8 cords stacked," he had said, "your 2 children will freeze in that shanty before Candlemas." He had been wrong. The cabin after the storm was not blazing. It was not miraculous. It was quiet. A whitewashed wall still warm under the hand, a mitten drying on a peg, a child asleep without breath smoking in the room. Outside, a wood pile still standing higher than any neighbor thought possible. So Rosina Ternes had arrived in Dakota Territory with $47, 2 children, and no knowledge of how to lay a heating flue. She had buried a husband, faced a winter that should have killed her, and built something that outlasted them both. The fire had gone out hours before, but the bricks were still giving back what the winter tried to take.